Imagine a German intelligence officer in 1944 staring at a report on his desk. A report so unbelievable, he thinks it has to be American propaganda. The numbers claim the United States has produced over 300,000 military aircraft. Fighters, bombers, transports. More planes than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined could ever hope to build. To the Germans, this wasn't just unlikely, it sounded physically impossible. And yet, within months, swarms of American planes would fill the skies over Europe and the Pacific, proving that what they once dismissed as a lie was actually their worst nightmare becoming real. Now the real story begins. When World War II broke out, Germany believed it held an enormous advantage. The Luftwaffe was well-trained, combat-proven, and supported by years of strategic planning. German officers laughed at the idea that the United States, a nation that barely had an army in 1939, could ever become a major air power. In fact, in late 1940, Germany estimated America could produce at most 40,000 aircraft during the entire war. A respectable number, yes, but still far below what Germany and its allies believed they could match. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't understand, was the industrial giant that was about to wake up. The United States was not prepared for war in 1939, but it possessed something far more dangerous than a large army, an industrial machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. America had thousands of factories, millions of workers, endless natural resources, massive steel production, and the world's greatest automobile assembly lines. But most importantly, it had a leader. As 1942 arrived, the scale of American manufacturing became clearer, yet still not believable to German analysts. The U.S. was now producing thousands of fighters and bombers each month. P-38 Lightnings, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-24 Liberators, and eventually B-29 Superfortresses rolled off assembly lines in numbers that dwarfed the Luftwaffe. Germany still clung to the idea that this was propaganda. In fact, some German officers believed that America must be double counting or exaggerating because no industrial system could sustain such output. They couldn't accept the possibility that allies might be telling the truth, that the United States was not preparing for war, but for total domination of the air. However, by 1943, the truth could no longer be denied. The sky itself began proving America's numbers. Hundreds of B-17 filled the air over Europe, escorted by waves of P-47s. Then came the P-51 Mustang with long-range drop tanks, stretching across the continent like a steel storm. German pilots who once flew confidently now faced squadrons upon squadrons of American fighters. Every time a Luftwaffe ace landed, he reported the same thing. We shot down 10 bombers and 20 more took their place. The Luftwaffe's core strength, its skill, could no longer overcome America's newest weapon, overwhelming numbers. By this time, German intelligence began analyzing U.S. industrial figures more seriously. Reports now estimated American airplane output as high as 10,000 per month, far beyond anything the Reich could match. But even then, some within the Nazi high command dismissed the figures as impossible. They clung to the belief that the Allies were inflating production numbers as psychological warfare. The truth was much worse for Germany. America wasn't lying. If anything, the official reports underestimated the real totals. By the end of 1944, the United States had produced over 96,000 aircraft in a single year, more than Japan produced during the entire war. Germany now faced a terrifying reality. The American propaganda had not only been real, it had been conservative. The Luftwaffe was no longer outmatched. It was overwhelmed. Yeah, I know. Pilots were exhausted, fuel was scarce, replacement aircraft were dwindling, and losses were impossible to replace. Meanwhile, American aircrews arrived in Europe with brand new machines built by factories working 3 shifts, 7 days a week. The real turning point for German belief came when U.S. aircraft production outpaced the Luftwaffe's ability to fight. In early 1944, the Allies launched Big Week, a massive series of air attacks targeting German aircraft production. American bombers shredded German factories, while the P-51 Mustang tore through fighter defenses. Germany realized the nightmare they once laughed at had become reality. The United States wasn't just producing more aircraft. It was producing them faster than Germany could destroy them. By the final year of the war, the scale of America's aviation output had become undeniable. The skies over Europe and the Pacific were filled with American planes, fighters, bombers, transports, patrol craft, so many that German officers finally conceded the truth. Roosevelt's 300,000 plane goal, once mocked as absurd propaganda, had been nearly achieved. In just 4 years, America built more aircraft than any nation in human history, creating an air force so massive that even after sending thousands into combat, thousands more waited in reserve. And this wasn't just an industrial achievement, it was a strategic masterstroke. America realized that wars could be won by drowning the enemy in resources. Germany believed in skilled pilots and elite fighters. America believed in producing so many planes that skill alone could not stop them. In the end, the factory defeated the fighter, the assembly line defeated the ace, and the nation once dismissed as industrially soft became the world's dominant air power. When American factories switched to full wartime production in 1942, German intelligence analysts were confused. They had spent years studying U.S. industrial capacity, yet the numbers coming from their own spies suddenly made no sense. Reports claimed that the Americans were producing the aircraft at a rate no nation had ever achieved. To the Germans, it looked impossible, even laughable. Berlin newspapers called it Roosevelt's propaganda, insisting that the United States was exaggerating to intimidate the Axis powers. But inside German high command meetings, officers whispered a different fear. What if the numbers were... By mid-1942, Germany's own aircraft industry was straining to keep up with losses on all fronts. The Luftwaffe had already suffered heavy casualties in the Battle of Britain, the African desert, and over the Eastern Front. Factories in Germany were bombed constantly, forcing production to scatter into underground facilities and improvised workshops. Skilled workers were drafted into the army, leaving factories understaffed and less efficient. Even when parts were available, fuel shortages made training new pilots nearly impossible. Germany could design excellent aircraft. The FW-190, the Bf-109, later the Me-262 jet, but it could not build enough of them to match the demands of a multi-front war. Meanwhile, the United States, sitting safely across the Atlantic, had something Germany did not: space, manpower, and an industrial system built for mass production. Henry Ford, William Knudsen, and hundreds of American industrial leaders transformed civilian factories at a speed the world had never witnessed. Car assembly lines, refrigerator plants, and typewriter factories were stripped overnight and rebuilt to produce aircraft components. Companies that had never made a single plane suddenly manufactured thousands. The legendary Willow Run plant in Michigan became the best example. Before the war, it produced nothing. But Ford promised the government that his factory could build a B-24 Liberator bomber every hour. German analysts found the claim so absurd, they dismissed it as psychological warfare. But it wasn't propaganda, it was engineering. Willow Run expanded into a structure so huge that workers joked it had its own weather system. Inside, tens of thousands of men and women worked around the clock. Machinery ran day and night. Steel, aluminum, and rubber from all over America flowed in through giant doors and came out the other side as fully assembled bombers. Workers who had never touched an aircraft before the war learned to perform specialized tasks with exact precision. A young woman might spend her entire shift drilling the same rivet on the same wing panel, thousands of times, until she became faster than any craftsman in pre-war Europe. This level of repetition allowed the U.S. to build planes like cars, standardized and interchangeable and incredibly fast. German intelligence listened to Allied radio broadcasts claiming that America would produce 50,000 planes in 1942 alone. They laughed. Impossible, they wrote in the classified reports. Industrial lies. They believed that the United States might reach 15,000 or maybe 20,000 planes if it pushed hard. But when the year ended and the real numbers were confirmed, German officers were stunned. America hadn't built 50,000 planes, it had built more than that, and it was just warming up. By the end of 1943, American aircraft production had doubled again. Washington announced a goal that sounded insane by European standards: 300,000 planes in 4 years. To German officers, that was not propaganda. It was a nightmare. The key to America's success was scale. The U.S. did not rely on a handful of specialized factories. Thousands of companies across the entire nation contributed. Engine manufacturers in Ohio shipped power plants to California. Rubber factories in the South produced tires for trainers and bombers. Shipyards built aircraft carriers so American planes could reach every ocean. Students were taught to build parts in schools, farms sent metal scrap for recycling, and millions of American women replaced male factory workers who were sent to the front lines. In Germany, the idea of having factory shifts run by women was initially dismissed as unsuitable. By late 1943, U.S. production was so massive that bombers filled the skies in numbers Germany had never imagined possible. Single raids involved more aircraft than Germany could build in months. Even if the Luftwaffe managed to shoot down dozens or even hundreds, the Americans replaced them instantly. Meanwhile, every German aircraft lost represented months of labor, rare materials, and highly trained workers. The math was brutally simple. Germany could not compete. At the same time, America produced a wider variety of aircraft than any Axis nation. Fighters like the P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt dominated the skies. Bombers like the B-17 and B-24 shattered German industry. Transport aircraft like the C-47 supplied entire armies. The United States didn't just build warplanes, it built an entire flying military ecosystem. Each new aircraft meant more pressure on Germany, more raids, more supply lines secured, more pilots trained, and more defeats for the Axis. German soldiers on the Eastern Front began noticing something strange in late 1943. Wounded Luftwaffe pilots were told to return to combat almost immediately, even if their injuries weren't fully healed. Their replacements were young, inexperienced, and overwhelmed. Many barely understood their aircraft. This wasn't incompetence, it was pure exhaustion. Germany was running out of skilled pilots, and the few who remained were stretched thin across the shrinking front lines. In contrast, American pilots rotated regularly, had access to abundant spare parts, slept in safe bases, and flew machines that were replaced the moment they were damaged. Inside the Reich Air Ministry, the stress was obvious. Minister Hermann Göring, once boasting about the strength of the Luftwaffe, now received reports describing catastrophic losses. His frustration reached a breaking point when he heard that the U.S. had achieved yet another production record. "I knew we had lost the war," he would later say, "when I saw American fighters over Berlin." Those fighters were P-51 Mustangs, long-range escorts made possible only because the U.S. could build engines, drop tanks, and airframes in insane quantities. Without mass production, the Mustang could never have flown from England to Berlin and back. By 1944, German factory workers could actually see American aircraft being built. Not directly, but in the form of the bombs falling on their cities. Every time a B-17 formation thundered overhead, it was a reminder that the Americans had replaced each shot-down bomber with two new ones. No matter how many planes Germany built, a few hundred here, a few thousand there, it was nothing compared to the tidal wave coming from across the Atlantic. The final shock came when Germany realized that the U.S. was not even using its full industrial potential. Even while building tanks, ships, weapons, and uniforms, the country still had factories that had never been switched to wartime production because the output was already exceeding expectations. Germany was fighting at 100% production. America was fighting at 50% and still overwhelming the Axis. This was the truth behind Roosevelt's 300,000 planes. It wasn't propaganda, it wasn't exaggeration. It was the reality of a nation with limitless resources, boundless manpower, and a manufacturing system perfectly designed for global war. Germany realized this far too late. By the time they accepted the numbers were real, the skies over Europe were filled with American aircraft, and every one of them was a symbol of industrial dominance the Nazis could never match. As American aircraft began pouring into the battlefields in staggering numbers, the impact was felt not just in the factories or in military headquarters, but directly on the front lines. For German soldiers, pilots, and commanders, the war itself started to change shape. The skies, once dominated by the Luftwaffe in the early years of the war, were gradually turning into a symbol of American industrial might. By 1943, German troops joked bitterly that if a bird flew overhead, it was probably an American plane. It wasn't far from the truth. The sheer presence of U.S. aircraft began to reshape everything: battles, supply lines, morale, and even the German strategy for survival. One of the first major signs of this transformation came in the skies over North Africa. When German and Italian forces fought against the British and Americans, they noticed something that shocked them. At this stage, German pilots started reporting something alarming back to their superiors. The Americans were flying more missions per day than the Luftwaffe could even attempt. One American air group might send out 3 or 4 major missions in a single day, while German squadrons struggled to complete even one due to fuel shortages and worn-out engines. The Americans weren't just sending more aircraft into the fight, they were flying them more often, repairing them faster, and supplying them better. It was a dangerous formula that the Axis simply couldn't match. When the Allied invasion of Italy began in 1943, the pattern repeated itself. German units defending the mountainous terrain quickly realized that American fighters and bombers never seemed to run out. Each time German positions were strengthened, another wave of American aircraft dismantled them. Bridges blown up by Germans were rebuilt by the Allies, but German attempts to rebuild their own bridges were destroyed again within hours by American air attacks. Even at night, transport planes flew continuously, dropping supplies and reinforcements where needed. To German commanders, it felt like fighting against a nation with unlimited resources. But the true turning point, the moment when German morale began to collapse, came with the strategic bombing campaign over Germany. Every month, American raids grew larger and more accurate. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Frankfurt found themselves hit repeatedly. Factories were destroyed, railroads shattered, fuel refineries set ablaze. Despite these losses, Germany tried desperately to increase aircraft production. But every time they made progress, the Americans simply bombed the factories again. To make matters worse for Germany, the U.S. wasn't just building more planes, it was building better ones. The introduction of the P-51 Mustang changed the nature of air combat forever. Suddenly, American bombers had a fighter escort that could travel deep into German airspace, even reaching Berlin and back. When German pilots saw the first Mustangs overhead, the reaction was shock. Long-range escort fighters had been considered nearly impossible. Germany believed American bombers would always be vulnerable on the final stretch of their missions. But the Mustang destroyed that hope entirely. Mustang pilots began hunting the Luftwaffe relentlessly. They pursued German fighters all the way up to their airfields, sometimes even shooting them as they took off or landed. For the first time, the Luftwaffe couldn't even retreat to safety. The skies that once protected Germany had become a battleground where American fighters held total control. The Luftwaffe's most experienced aces, pilots with 100 or more victories, were now being killed or forced down at an alarming rate. Every ace lost was irreplaceable because Germany no longer had the fuel or time to train new pilots to that level of skill. Meanwhile, American pilot training continued at full strength. Thousands of new American pilots graduated every month, each trained with far more flight hours than their German counterparts. Germany running out of fuel shortened pilot training dramatically. New German pilots sometimes entered combat with only a handful of hours in the cockpit of their aircraft. Many didn't survive their first mission. American pilots, by contrast, gained experience steadily. Some flew dozens of missions and returned home safely before another group of equally trained pilots took their place. By 1944, the air war had become completely one-sided. German radar stations tracked incoming raids and reported numbers that were impossible to believe. Sometimes more than 1,000 American bombers approached in a single day, each escorted by hundreds of fighters. Even if German flak guns managed to shoot down a few aircraft, the waves just kept coming. German civilians began to joke grimly that the Americans had more planes than stars in the sky, a dark attempt at humor to hide the despair. On the ground, German soldiers felt the change as well. During the Battle of Normandy after D-Day, American fighter bombers swarmed the battlefield. American aircraft also played a crucial role in cutting off German supply lines. Every bridge, crossroads, and railway became a target. Even if a German division wanted to counterattack, it often couldn't because its fuel trucks had been destroyed by American airstrikes. Entire units surrendered not because they were defeated in battle, but because they simply ran out of food, fuel, or ammunition. The skies had become the most powerful weapon in the Allied arsenal. As the war dragged on, German leadership realized that the industrial race was already lost. Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, admitted that no nation in Europe could match American production capacity. He wrote later that when he studied American industrial reports, he understood that Germany was fighting a hopeless battle. But Hitler refused to accept this reality. He believed Germany could still develop wonder weapons that would change the course of the war: jet fighters, long-range missiles, new anti-aircraft guns. And while some of these weapons were technologically advanced, they weren't built in large enough numbers to challenge American dominance. The Me-262 jet fighter, for example, could outrun any Allied plane, but Germany built only a few hundred of them. The Americans, on the other hand, built thousands of P-51s, tens of thousands of P-47s, and nearly 100,000 training aircraft. A single American production run could exceed the entire jet program of the Reich. Even when American bombers destroyed Me-262 factories, the Luftwaffe had no way to replace them fast enough. Every advanced aircraft Germany produced represented precious materials and time, and each one shot down was a devastating loss. By the winter of 1944, Germany's skies were no longer a place for pilots. They were a place of destruction. Smoke from bombed cities rose into the clouds. Entire industrial regions were reduced to ruins. The once proud Luftwaffe, which had shocked Europe in 1939 and 1940, was reduced to scattered groups of inexperienced pilots flying outdated machines. Meanwhile, American aircraft filled the horizon from dawn to dusk. Bombers struck factories, fighters destroyed transport, and reconnaissance planes mapped the battlefield with precision. German citizens saw American aircraft so often that they knew the engine sounds by heart. Children could identify a B-17 or P-51 just by listening from their basements. For them, the war was no longer about tanks or infantry. It was about the sky, and the sky belonged to America. The Luftwaffe, once the sharpest sword of the German war machine, was now broken. And the reason was clear: America's ability to build planes at a scale the world had never seen. Roosevelt's promise had been mocked as propaganda. But now, as Germany watched the endless parade of American aircraft dominate every front, it was undeniable. The 300,000 plane dream wasn't a myth. It was a reality. And it had changed the course of World War II forever. By early 1945, the German High Command was living in a strange, painful reality, a world where the skies seemed permanently owned by the United States. Every day, new reports arrived from the front lines describing the same story. American aircraft everywhere, all the time, striking with precision, speed, and overwhelming numbers. It wasn't simply the destruction they caused. It was the psychological weight of knowing that no matter how fiercely German forces fought on the ground, the American war machine above them was unstoppable. Roosevelt's airplane program, once laughed at by German officers as fantasy propaganda, had grown into a force that reshaped the entire war. For German soldiers trying to defend the collapsing front, the worst moment was dawn. As the sun rose, the first sound they heard was often the distant rumble of American engines. Many described it as the sound of doom, a sound that reminded them they were fighting a country with more aircraft than Germany could ever shoot down. In the skies above the crumbling Reich, American bombers formed massive formations stretching for miles, an armada of steel that darkened the air with their shadows. And behind them, the imbalance was brutal and undeniable. Many German pilots called it slaughter. One Luftwaffe ace wrote in his diary that attacking an American bomber formation felt like charging at a steel mountain, because behind every bomber were fighters ready to tear apart anything that came close. Even experienced pilots who had survived years of air combat were being shot down within minutes of engaging American formations. Some didn't even reach the enemy. They were hunted and destroyed before they could climb high enough to join the fight. The destruction wasn't limited to factories and cities. American Airpower targeted Germany's entire war-making capacity. Bridges, fuel depots, railway yards, ammunition plants, vehicle workshops, and troop trains were all struck repeatedly. The German war machine didn't just lose aircraft. It lost everything needed to keep aircraft flying: fuel, spare parts, engines, and trained mechanics. Even newly built German planes often sat idle because no fuel was available to test them. Meanwhile, America's production lines ran day and night, powered by millions of workers, thousands of factories, and a level of industrial coordination no country in the world could match. Assembly lines designed by Ford, Boeing, North American, and Lockheed produced aircraft with incredible efficiency. A B-24 bomber rolled off Ford's Willow Run assembly line every 63 minutes. Some factories built engines faster than Germany could build bicycles. And unlike Germany, American factories weren't being bombed. They operated at full speed without interruption. One of the biggest advantages America possessed wasn't just the planes themselves, but the spare parts. For every fighter or bomber produced, American factories produced multiple sets of replacement parts. This meant American aircraft could be repaired quickly, sometimes within hours. German pilots were stunned to learn that a U.S. bomber that limped home badly damaged might be back in the air within days. In Germany, similar repairs often took weeks, if spare parts could even be found. As the war intensified, American logistics became a weapon just as powerful as any aircraft. In Normandy, Belgium, France, and eventually Germany itself, U.S. airfields filled with planes faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them. Engineers repaired runways overnight, built new ones in record time, and set up maintenance centers capable of servicing hundreds of planes a day. Even the weather couldn't stop American operations for long. If a storm grounded planes in one area, U.S. commanders simply shifted missions to another region where the skies were clear. By contrast, German supply lines were collapsing. Fuel was rationed so heavily that some Luftwaffe units received only enough gasoline for a few training flights each month. New pilots sometimes had flight logs with only 30 to 40 total hours, compared to American trainees who often had more than 250 before reaching their first combat mission. Experienced German pilots, unable to train replacements properly, watched helplessly as inexperienced recruits were thrown into battles they had no chance of surviving. In the final months of the war, the Luftwaffe resorted to desperate tactics. Some pilots were ordered to ram American bombers because ammunition was too scarce. Others flew missions knowing they did not have enough fuel to return home. Meanwhile, American aircraft operated with such confidence that pilots sometimes compared their missions to flying over a defeated country. As Germany crumbled under the pressure, American aircraft became a constant presence over retreating German forces. In the Ruhr pocket, where hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were encircled, American fighter bombers struck relentlessly. Wherever a unit tried to escape, Mustangs and Thunderbolts appeared overhead, cutting them off. When German commanders attempted to reinforce the area, their convoys were annihilated from the air. One German officer later said, "We lost the war because the Americans owned the sky." And he wasn't exaggerating. By 1945, American aircraft were not just winning battles, they were reshaping Germany's geography. Major rivers became impossible to cross because every bridge was destroyed. Railroads were bombed so frequently that German trains could only travel at night, and even then with great risk. Factories relocated underground still couldn't escape detection, as American reconnaissance aircraft photographed every detail with incredible precision. Even more devastating was the bombing campaign against Germany's fuel production. Synthetic fuel plants were hit repeatedly until they shut down completely. Without fuel, tanks became useless, trucks sat frozen in place, and aircraft couldn't take off. American strategists called it the chokehold strategy, and once it took effect, Germany's ability to wage war evaporated almost overnight. As the Allies advanced deeper into German territory, captured documents revealed something astonishing. Germany had never believed Roosevelt's claim that America would produce 50,000 aircraft a year. German intelligence labeled the number mathematically impossible. When Roosevelt later increased the goal to 100,000 aircraft a year, Germany dismissed it again as fantasy. But by the end of the war, America had built more than 300,000 aircraft, triple the number German analysts believed possible. The Luftwaffe had no chance against a nation producing more planes in a single month than Germany could build in a year. When American troops entered German cities, civilians often pointed to the sky and said, "That is how we lost." They weren't pointing at a specific plane. They were pointing at the idea, the overwhelming, crushing reality of American air power. The factories, the assembly lines, the workers, the raw materials, the logistics, the training programs, the maintenance crews, the airfields, the fuel, the spare parts, the endless waves of aircraft that never seemed to stop coming. In the end, the Luftwaffe didn't just lose the war, it was overwhelmed, drowned under an ocean of American aircraft. Roosevelt's promise, once mocked as political propaganda, became the most devastating truth of World War II. Germany laughed at the number, America built it, and the skies of Europe were never the same again.